What is up, family? I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to talk about something that I believe is a very unique topic, and that is looking at the crucifixion event of Jesus not from a theological perspective, but rather looking at it from how what happened to Jesus actually shows us the nature of this earthly physical realm that we currently find ourselves in, at least in this particular age and time period. Now, again, this is not going to be a theological discussion. However, for the sake of this talk, we have to understand what Jesus represents. I was just reflecting on this, and Jesus, out of any historical spiritual figure, is one of the most respected and highly reverenced spiritual figures of all time. Because even though there is a different conclusion about who Jesus was across the different spiritual traditions, almost every spiritual tradition acknowledges that Jesus was a representative of God in truth itself. So, for example, Christianity views Jesus as literally God, right? But a religion like Islam views Jesus as a prophet of God. And in the Vedic tradition, depending on who you're talking to, Jesus is viewed as an avatar of God or a perfectly self-realized guru. And on it goes across the different spiritual traditions, that even though the final conclusion about who Jesus was is different, there's still this acknowledgement that Jesus is a representative of God in truth itself. And it is from that vantage point that we will go into this discussion now and reflect on how what happened to Jesus actually shows us the nature of this realm that we are currently in. Now, Jesus, being the representative of God in truth itself, represents the highest level of consciousness, right? And he was living in a time period where there was a lot of low consciousness, which, of course, is similar to today, right? And Jesus was showing people in his culture and time period, which is the culture of the Old Testament religion, of course, he was showing people the way to God. But what you see when you're reading this story is that many people were not capable of understanding him. And more, many people viewed him as a threat. And I'd like to reflect on this today. Why is it that so many people were not capable of understanding him, and why did they view him as a threat? Well, to start with, everyone is operating at different levels of consciousness, and people can only understand reality based on what level of consciousness they are at. They can only perceive the world based on where they are. And Jesus, being the representative of God in the highest possible level of consciousness, is speaking to people at a lower level of consciousness. Of course, he is imparting spiritual knowledge on people. And the only way an individual can learn from a individual that is operating in a higher spiritual level of consciousness than them is to surrender their ego. It is to humble themselves. And Jesus, in his time period, there were very few people that humbled themselves to try to learn from him. And the ego is also the reason why so many people viewed him as a threat. You see, the ego clings on to its worldview that it has. The ego always wants to be right. The ego never wants to admit it's wrong. And the ego is closed off to learning new information because the ego quite literally represents the opposite of humility. So what we see in the story of Jesus is we see how you have Jesus showing people the way to God, but all of these people operate in this low level of consciousness. And because very few people were willing to surrender their ego and humble themselves, instead they viewed him as a threat because what he was speaking of, the knowledge he was imparting, was very different from the knowledge they had in their level of consciousness of the Old Testament at the time. So they viewed him as a threat and ultimately killed him. Which leads to the next theme that we see in the crucifixion story. Who is it that had this problem with Jesus? You see, there's like all of these people that had an issue with him. But who was it? It was actually religious people, and this is very telling, right? Because, these were people that were very well versed in Scripture. These are people that studied the Old Testament. These were people that had memorized verses in the Bible. And yet, here's Jesus standing in front of them, this perfect, elevated being that represents God and truth itself. And they couldn't even recognize him. And that leads to a question. How many people would recognize Jesus today? If Jesus were to go into a fundamentalist Protestant church, how many people do you think would recognize him? Again, these are people that would be very well versed in Scripture. These are people that would have a very strong mental understanding of the Bible. But how many of them would actually recognize him? And I'm not talking about recognize him physically, like recognize his image. I'm talking about qualitatively. How many of them would recognize who he really was? I think you know the answer to that. How many people would surrender their egos? How many people would humble themselves? I think you know the answer to that. See, what happened to Jesus really shows us the nature of this current world. Jesus, being the representative of truth itself and high consciousness, it was very misunderstood. And we could say the same things today about people operating in higher consciousness. You see, Jesus was called a heretic in his time. And after Jesus' death, there were countless heretics throughout history that were persecuted by people of lower consciousness. Ironically, many of these people that were called heretical were actually very spiritually advanced. But because the lower consciousness people didn't have the ability to understand something of a higher consciousness and also didn't surrender their ego to try to understand, they killed people for this. And this has gone on all throughout history. And you can even apply this outside of the religious, outside of religion. We could apply this to truth itself, right? We live in a world, in this realm, where truth itself is actively suppressed. And anytime somebody's operating in a high level of consciousness, trying to spread truth, oftentimes they're met with resistance, violence, suppression, censorship, etc. This has been happening all throughout this current age that we're in. But I'd like to reflect on one more aspect of the crucifixion story of Jesus. Who was it that ultimately did the crucifixion, right? So you had the religious people that had the issue with him. Who was it that did the crucifixion? It was the state, right? And again, this shows us exactly in modern times. The state often operates as the enforcement to truth. It is often the enforcement of suppressing truth. And I mean, think about 2020, guys. All of the suppression of truth. Think about all of the suppression of truth in this time period. This is not what we see today with the media and politicians and all of this stuff. Again, this story of Jesus shows us the nature of this realm. But anyways, I think I'm going to cut it off there. And I hope you have a wonderful night tonight. Have a great night and peace.